My son raised his glass of expensive wine, boasting to 30 guests that he built this penthouse lifestyle himself. When he told me to pay rent or get out, I simply untied my apron and left. He thought he was evicting a burden, but he was actually evicting his landlord. As I walked into the elevator, I knew it would take less than a week to turn his arrogant dreams into a nightmare. He forgot who signed the checks. My name is Eleanor Cole, and for the last 2 hours, I had been invisible in my own property. The holiday party was in full swing, a cacophony of jazz music and forced laughter echoing off the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse. Outside, the lights of Chicago shimmered against the dark void of Lake Michigan, a view that cost millions of dollars. Inside, 30 guests in velvet and silk sipped vintage Cabernet, oblivious to the woman in the simple grey dress weaving through them with a heavy tray of hors d'oeuvres. I paused near the marble kitchen island, my back aching. My son, Ethan, stood in the center of the living room, holding court. He looked handsome in his bespoke suit, his 35 years sitting lightly on his shoulders, though his face was flushed with wine and arrogance. It is all about the grind. Boys, Ethan declared, gesturing broadly to the room. You want the view? You want the Tesla Model X downstairs? You have to take it. I built this life with my own 2 hands. Sabrina, his wife, giggled from the sofa, phone raised high to capture the perfect angle of her cheekbones against the skyline. Ethan works so hard, she chirped, checking her engagement metrics. We are literally exhausted from building our empire. I lowered my eyes, adjusting the tray of sliced turkey. I had paid for that suit. I had paid for the deposit on that Tesla. I had signed the deed to this penthouse before Ethan even finished architecture school. Yet, to everyone here, I was just the old mother crashing on their couch. Ethan caught my eye, but there was no warmth in it. He turned back to his colleagues, his voice dropping to a stage whisper that was meant to be heard. Honestly, the only thing slowing me down is overhead. You know how it is. You have to carry family members who just refuse to cut the cord. The group laughed awkwardly. A man in a blue tie glanced at me and quickly looked away. Sabrina set her phone down, her smile sharp. Well, babe, she said, her voice carrying over the music. If Mom wants to live here, she should at least chip in for rent. It is only fair. Right. We are not living in the Dark Ages. Everyone pulls their weight. Ethan straightened his back, emboldened by the alcohol in the audience. He looked directly at me. The room went quiet. The jazz piano seemed to mock the sudden tension. Mom, Ethan said, his voice loud. Sabrina is right. If you want to continue living here, you need to pay your share of the rent, like everyone else. Otherwise, well, you should find a place that fits your retirement income. The silence that followed was suffocating. 30 pairs of eyes fixed on me. I waited for someone to speak up. I waited for someone to say, "That is your mother, Ethan." But no one did. They just stared, grateful it was not them being eviscerated. I stood frozen. The silver tray felt like lead in my hands. The humiliation burned my cheeks, hot and stinging. But I forced my face to remain absolute stone. I did not cry. I did not scream. Slowly, deliberately. I walked to the counter and set the tray down. I untied my apron, folded it into a perfect square, and wiped my hands on a cloth. When I turned back to them, my voice was barely a whisper, yet it cut through the room. "Thank you all for coming," I said, looking right at my son. This, this will probably be the last Christmas I eat dinner in this house. Oh, come on. Mom. Ethan scoffed, waving a hand dismissively as he saw the guests shifting uncomfortably. Do not make this a scene. We are just having an adult conversation about finances. Exactly, Sabrina added, reaching for her wine glass. Financial independence is healthy. Eleanor. I did not answer. I turned my back on them and walked down the hallway, the sound of their nervous chatter resuming behind me like a swarm of bees. I entered my guest room and closed the door. The moment the latch clicked, the strength left my legs. I leaned back against the wood, sliding down until I hit the floor. My hands were shaking so hard I had to clasp them together to stop the tremors. The pain in my chest was a physical weight, a crushing realization that the boy I had raised had truly become a stranger. But as I sat there, the tears stopped before they began. The shaking ceased. My breathing slowed, and the hurt in my eyes hardened into something cold and sharp. I stood up and walked to the small closet, pushing aside my modest coats. I revealed a small, fireproof safe bolted to the floor. I spun the dial left to 10, right to 24, left to 8. It clicked open. Inside, there was no jewelry, no cash, just a thick stack of manila folders. I pulled out the top one. The label on the cover was crisp and clear. Heartline Developments, LLC. I ran my fingers over the legal documents that proved I owned the building, the unit, and the very ground my son was standing on. The heavy folder in my hands smelled faintly of dust and old ink, a scent that instantly transported me back 40 years. I was not the grey-haired woman being humiliated in a penthouse. I was a 20-year-old girl in a dying industrial town in Ohio. My parents had broken their backs in the steel mills, and I had followed their path of hard labour, dropping out of college to work 2 jobs just to keep the lights on. By day, I was a secretary filing invoices. By night, I was waiting tables at a diner where the tips were as meagre as the hope in the town. That was where I met Jacob. He was an Irish-American bricklayer with hands so calloused they felt like sandpaper. But his touch was the gentlest thing I had ever known. I am going to build us a life. Elle. He had told me on our first date, his eyes bright with a hunger that matched my own. Not just a house, a real life. We married 3 months later in my parents' backyard. There was no orchestra, just a radio playing on the porch. Our honeymoon was a bus ride to a lake 2 towns over because we could not afford a plane ticket. When we moved to Chicago, we rented a drafty, shoebox apartment in the outer suburbs. For 10 years. We worked 12 to 14 hours a day. We ate canned soup and wore second-hand coats so we could put every single spare dollar into a rusted metal box hidden beneath our bed. It took a decade of sweating and scraping to buy our first property, a derelict 2-story house on the west side that the city had practically condemned. It looks like a disaster. But the bones are good, Jacob had said, tapping a crumbling wall. He spent his nights rewiring electricity and soldering pipes until his fingers bled. I spent mine teaching myself tax law and accounting at the kitchen table. We turned that wreck into 3 rental units. That was the seed. From that single seed, we bought another, and then another. We gave our empire a name that sounded faceless and corporate, Heartline Developments, LLC. We played a game with the world, to the outsiders. Jacob was just a hard-working subcontractor, and I was the simple housewife who packed his lunch. They never saw the reality. They never saw that every loan, every deed, and every strategic acquisition was signed by me. It was a shield. If things went wrong, they would underestimate us. Ethan was born into the middle of this ascent. But we made a fatal mistake. We shielded him too well. He saw the move from the cramped apartment to a nice house in the suburbs. He saw the private school uniforms and the expensive gaming computers. He never saw the late-night panic over interest rates or the times Jacob and I held hands over the kitchen table, praying a tenant would pay on time so we could cover the mortgage. Then came the day the world stopped. Jacob collapsed on a job site, his heart giving out before the ambulance could even arrive. I buried the love of my life on a Tuesday. On Wednesday, I was in a lawyer's office, eyes swollen but dry, signing the restructuring papers. I took 80% of the shares and gave 20% to Marcus Lee, a brilliant young African-American project manager who had been Jacob's right hand. Eleanor, Marcus had said softly, sliding the papers across the mahogany desk. Are you sure you want to handle this alone, Ethan? Maybe he should know the extent of it. No, I had replied, my voice cracking before I steadied it. He is 25. Marcus. He thinks money grows on trees. If he knows I am the chairman of Heartline, he will never work a day in his life. Let him think I am just living on a pension. Let him think he has to take care of me. I thought it would make him a man. I thought the burden of supporting his mother would teach him the responsibility his father had in his blood. I looked down at the documents in my lap, the paper trembling slightly in my grip. I had been so wrong. My silence did not build a man. It built a monster who thought he could discard me the moment I became an inconvenience. You wanted to play the big shot. Ethan? I whispered to the empty room. So let us see how you handle the bill. It wasn't that Ethan was untalented. He graduated with a decent degree in architecture and landed a job at a mid-sized firm here in Chicago. The starting salary was respectable, enough for a comfortable life in a one-bedroom apartment and a reliable sedan. But Ethan did not want comfortable. He wanted spectacular, and he wanted it immediately. The slide into delusion began on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Ethan came to visit me at the small apartment I pretended was my only home in reality, just another asset in my portfolio. He paced around my living room, agitated, running his hands through his hair. Mum, you do not get it, he said, his voice tight with frustration. In this industry, image is everything. I cannot bring clients back to a studio apartment in the suburbs. If I want to land the big contracts, I need to look like I am already successful. I need a brand. I sat quietly with my tea, listening to his complaints about rent prices in the Loop. He was talking about $3,000 a month for a shoebox. He didn't know that the very building he was lusting after was one I had acquired 2 years ago. That night, I opened the secure files on my laptop. I saw Unit 4B, the riverfront penthouse, was sitting vacant. The market rate was nearly $5,000 a month. I made a decision that felt like kindness then, but looking back, it was the first shovel of dirt for the hole he is standing in now. I made some calls. I told him the next day. I know a property manager who owes a favor to a friend of mine. He can get you into that riverfront building for $1,800 a month. Ethan's jaw dropped. 1,800. That is impossible. Are you using your savings to cover the difference? Do not worry about the details. I lied, protecting his ego. Just sign the lease. He signed the Heartline Developments contract without reading a single word. If he had, he would have seen the clause about immediate asset recovery upon notice. He just saw the view and assumed his mother was bleeding her retirement dry to support his dream. Then came Sabrina. She swept into his life like a hurricane of perfume and hashtags. She was beautiful. Yes. But her hunger for status made Ethan's look modest. Within a week of moving in, her Instagram was flooded with photos of the skyline view. "So proud of my husband." The caption read, "Built this life from scratch. Power couple architecture life." To complete the picture, I called Marcus. "Put him on the fleet insurance," I instructed. "Give him the Model X. Tell him it is a promotional lend from a partner company." Marcus hesitated on the other end of the line. "Eleanor, you are giving him a $100,000 car. He is just going to think he is invincible. He needs it for client meetings." I insisted, ignoring the knot in my stomach. But the car and the apartment were not enough. When Sabrina complained about the cost of maintaining a high-end lifestyle, I made my final mistake. I handed Ethan a black credit card. It was a supplementary card linked to my primary business account. "This is for emergencies only." "Ethan," I said sternly. "Medical issues. Urgent repairs. That is it." "Of course." "Mom," he said, hugging me, "I would never abuse your trust." The first month. The bill was $600 for groceries. Acceptable. The second month, it was $2,000. Charges from Michelin star restaurants, a boutique in the Gold Coast, and a weekend trip to a resort in Florida appeared on the statement. I sat at my desk, staring at the numbers. Every time I paid the bill, I told myself, it is just a phase. He is building his network. He will pay me back when he gets his big break. But then I would open my phone and see Sabrina's posts. A photo of a designer handbag with the caption, "Hubby spoiled me today." Hard work pays off. It was a lie bought with my money. Every like they got was a little theft of my dignity. I wanted to scream the truth. I wanted to shake him and say, "You are not rich. I am rich." But every time Ethan looked at me with that pitying glance, telling me, "Mom, do not worry. I will make sure you are taken care of one day," I swallowed the words. I let his arrogance grow until it filled the entire penthouse, leaving no room for the mother who actually owned it. And that brought us to last night. The moment he told me to pay rent was not a sudden snap. It was the inevitable conclusion of a monster I had spent 3 years feeding. The safe door swung open, revealing the truth that had been sitting under their noses for years. I pulled out the master file for Heartline Developments, LLC. My fingers traced the bold text on the Articles of Incorporation. It stated clearly that Eleanor Cole owned 82% of the company shares, with Marcus Lee holding the remaining 18%. I was not a dependent. I was the majority shareholder of the entity that owned the roof over their heads. I picked up my phone and dialed Marcus. It was late on Christmas Eve, but he answered on the second ring. "Eleanor, is everything all right?" My voice was steady, stripped of the trembling emotion I had felt in the hallway just minutes ago. "I need you to prepare some documents for tomorrow morning." "Marcus, I need a non-renewal notice for the lease on the penthouse unit. I need a repossession order for the company vehicle, the Tesla Model X. And I need a full itemized list of every transaction made on the supplementary credit card in the last 24 months. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Marcus knew exactly what this meant. "Ethan will be in shock," Marcus said, his voice low. "He thinks he owns that apartment." "Eleanor, are you sure about this? It is going to destroy him. The sooner it happens, the less cruel it will be later," I replied, staring at my reflection in the dark window. I have spoiled him for long enough. Today, he told me to pay rent. Tomorrow, he will understand who the landlord is. I hung up and began to pack. I did not take much. I packed 3 sets of clothes, my laptop, and the original legal files. I left behind the framed photos on the dresser, the cheap trinkets, and the books I had bought to fill the space. Those were props for the character of the helpless mother. That character was dead now. I zipped the suitcase shut. The sound was loud in the quiet room. I extended the handle and wheeled it out into the hallway. The wheels clicked rhythmically against the hardwood floor. Click, 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 cutting through the lingering murmur of the party. The guests had mostly dispersed to the balcony, but Sabrina and Ethan were near the kitchen. Sabrina spotted me first. She rolled her eyes, swirling her wine glass. "Oh, God." She sighed loudly. "Do not be so dramatic. Eleanor, we are just asking for a fair contribution." I stopped. I looked at her, then at Ethan, who was refusing to meet my eyes. "You people want adults to speak with money," I said, my voice cold and dry. "So, money will speak." I walked past them toward the private elevator. Ethan finally snapped out of his stupor and jogged a few steps after me. "Mum?" "Wait," he stammered, looking around nervously to see if anyone was watching. "Where are you going? You cannot just leave at midnight. Do you need money for a cab? I can call you an Uber." I pressed the call button. "I do not need your charity. Ethan, I have my own place." The elevator doors slid open. I stepped inside and turned to face him one last time as the doors began to close. He looked small, framed by the expensive foyer he thought he had earned. When I reached the lobby, the night doorman, Henry, rushed over to take my bag. He did not look at me with pity. He looked at me with deference. "Good evening, Ms. Cole," Henry said, nodding sharply. "Your car is waiting at the curb. The driver has the engine running." "Thank you." "Henry," I said. I stepped into the black sedan that belonged to the company fleet. It took me 40 minutes to drive to the northern suburbs, pulling up to a quiet, 2-story house hidden behind a row of oak trees. This was my real sanctuary. It was not flashy, but inside, the walls were lined with framed blueprints of skyscrapers and commercial centers. I sat down at my heavy oak desk and opened my laptop. The blue light of the screen illuminated my face as I logged into the Heartline internal network. I navigated to the folder labeled Assets Assigned to Relatives. There it was. Ethan Cole. With a few keystrokes, I could have deleted his access instantly. I could have shut off the power, locked the doors, and disabled the car remotely right then and there. But I stopped. I was not doing this out of rage. This had to be a lesson, not a tantrum. It had to be legal. It had to be undeniable. I set the termination dates for 30 days out, strictly following the law. I flagged the credit card for immediate cancellation due to misuse of funds. I drafted the formal eviction letter. Before I went to sleep, I pulled a piece of heavy cardstock from my drawer. I took my fountain pen and wrote a single line in my sharp, angular handwriting. "You once said you wanted to live like an adult. I am giving you the real chance to do that." I sealed it in an envelope to be delivered with the legal notices in the morning. I turned off the lamp and lay in the dark, my heart aching, but my mind absolutely clear. The hangover from the party was still throbbing behind my eyes when I opened my phone, expecting to see likes on the photos Sabrina had posted of the penthouse view. Instead, the first notification was an email from Heartline Property Management. The subject line was stark: Notice of lease termination. I sat up, blinking against the morning light. The email stated that my lease for the riverfront penthouse would be terminated in 30 days and would not be renewed. It demanded I vacate the premises and return the unit to its original condition. This is a mistake, I muttered to myself, my thumb hovering over the screen. It has to be a system error. I dialed the hotline number at the bottom of the email immediately. A woman with a voice as cold as ice water answered. I am looking at your file. Mr. Cole? She said. There is no mistake. The owner is exercising their right under Clause 14, Section B of your lease agreement to terminate tenancy with 30 days of notice. No cause is required. But I know the owner? I stammered, panic starting to rise in my chest. My mother arranged this. I cannot speak to personal relationships. Sir. The agent cut in. I can only speak to the contract you signed. You have until January 25th to vacate. I dropped the phone on the duvet. Beside me, Sabrina was already awake, scrolling through her feed. When I told her, the colour drained from her face, replaced instantly by a flush of rage. It is her! Sabrina screamed, throwing the duvet off. It is your mother. She is doing this because of what I said last night. Fix this. Ethan, call her right now and tell her to stop being petty. I called Mum's cell phone 5 times in a row. Each time, it rang 4 times and went straight to voicemail. She is not picking up, I said, my voice shaking. Useless, Sabrina spat. By noon, the nightmare had accelerated. An email from the Heartline Fleet Division pinged my inbox, urgent recall of company vehicle. The message stated that my authorization to operate the Tesla Model X had been revoked, and the vehicle had to be returned to the central garage within 48 hours, or it would be reported stolen. I felt like the floor was dissolving under my feet. But the final blow came at 2 p.m. Sabrina called me, her voice hysterical. My card was declined. Ethan? She shrieked. I am at the boutique with 3 associates watching, and the machine says card cancelled. Do you have any idea how humiliated I am? I do not understand. I whispered, gripping the edge of my desk at work. The bank said the primary cardholder closed the account, she yelled. You told me you handled the finances. You told me we were building an empire. You are just a child, living on an allowance, aren't you? I hung up, sweating cold despite the office air conditioning. I tried to compose myself, but I could feel the eyes of my colleagues on me. They were whispering. The news about the penthouse and the car was already leaking out. Chicago is a small town when you run in certain circles. My boss, Mr. Henderson, walked over to my desk. He didn't look happy. Ethan? A word, he said, gesturing to his glass-walled office. I walked in, legs feeling like jelly. We received a call from the client on the Riverside project. Henderson said, not inviting me to sit. They want you off the team. They cited concerns about financial stability and personal transparency. I do not know what stunt you pulled, but clients want steady, not flashy. I can explain. I started, but he held up a hand. Save it. We are restructuring the junior architect division, he said, sliding a white envelope across the desk. Today is your last day. I walked out of the building carrying a cardboard box with a stapler and a mug. In less than 8 hours, I had lost my home, my car, my credit, and my job. When I got back to the penthouse, the living room was a disaster zone of half-packed boxes. Sabrina was standing by the door with 2 large Louis Vuitton suitcases. She wasn't crying. She looked at me with pure disgust. "Where are you going?" I asked, my voice cracking. "Florida," she said, checking her reflection in the hallway mirror one last time. "I am going to stay with my parents to think." "Sabrina? Please?" "I can fix this," I begged, reaching for her hand. "It is just a setback. I will talk to Mom. I will get it all back." She pulled her hand away as if I were contagious. "You do not get it. Do not you?" she said, opening the door. "I did not marry you to go back to being poor. Ethan, call me when you are somebody again." The door slammed shut, leaving me alone in the silence of the penthouse that was no longer mine. Eleanor, 2 days later. I sat at the mahogany table in my home office, flanked by Marcus and Arthur, my personal attorney. The air was thick with the smell of old paper and serious decisions. I do not want the boy in jail. "Arthur," I said, resting my hands on the polished wood. "But I also do not want him continuing to live like a parasite on the labor of others." Arthur adjusted his glasses and slid a thick stack of papers across the table. It was the itemized summary of the supplementary credit card usage. My heart sank as I looked at the final figure. $214,000 in 24 months. Arthur read the number aloud, his voice devoid of emotion. Resorts in the Caribbean, designer clothing, unauthorized cash withdrawals. Legally. Eleanor, this is theft. You could press charges. I looked at the number. It represented years of rent payments from working-class families in my buildings. It represented roof repairs we had postponed. I kept my face calm, but inside, I felt a deep, hollowing disappointment. "No charges," I said firmly. "Draft a debt acknowledgement agreement. Every penny he spent is now a personal loan from Heartline to Ethan Cole. It carries interest. It will hang over his head until he pays it back. He can only qualify for debt forgiveness if he meets specific performance metrics over the next 5 years." Marcus nodded slowly. "He has no income. Eleanor, how is he going to pay a dime of this?" "That brings me to the next point," I said, turning to Marcus. "I want you to post a job listing internally and send it to the recruiters. We need an assistant building supervisor for the Lakeview Gardens property. The salary is $45,000 a year. Shift work. Manual labor required." "You want him to plunge toilets?" Marcus asked, raising an eyebrow. "I want him to work," I corrected. "Send his resume to the hiring manager as a potential candidate, but listen to me closely. There is no golden ticket. He interviews like everyone else. He answers to Dana Ruiz. If Dana thinks he is soft, she cuts him. Do not tell her he is my son. Ethan." While my mother was deciding my fate, I was learning exactly what my name was worth in this city without her money behind it. Nothing. I stood in the center of a studio apartment on the 3rd floor of a walk-up in a gritty neighborhood miles from the lake. The air smelled of stale cigarettes and mildew. The carpet was a suspicious shade of brown. It is the best I can do without proof of income. The landlord grunted, leaning against the doorframe. "First and last month, rent in cash. Take it or leave it. I will take it," I said, my voice hollow. I handed over the cash, the last significant chunk of my savings. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, hoping for a callback from one of the architecture firms I had applied to. Instead, it was a notification from Instagram. Sabrina. I clicked the link. It was a long, rambling post featuring a black and white photo of her looking out a rainy window. Sometimes you trust the wrong people. The caption read, I thought I was building a life with a partner, but I was being dragged down by someone who built a castle on sand. Lies about assets, lies about stability. Betrayal, moving on, stronger alone. I felt the heat rise in my neck. She was talking about me. The comments were already filling up with sympathy for her and vitriol for the unnamed fraud husband. The worst part was that she was not entirely wrong. I sat down on the bare mattress I had dragged up the stairs. My email inbox was full of rejection letters. It turned out that building a personal brand based on a lie had backfired. The architecture community was small. People were talking. They said I was a liability. They said I was unstable. I was alone. No wife. No mother. No penthouse. Just a stained carpet and the sound of a siren wailing in the distance. Eleanor, that night, the house was quiet. I sat in my armchair with a glass of water, the laptop open on my knees. On the screen, a paused video file from the penthouse security camera showed the moment from the Christmas party. I pressed play. I watched myself standing there, holding the tray of turkey. I watched Ethan stand up. I listened to him say the words again. If you want to continue living here, you must pay your share. It hurt. It hurt more than any physical blow. But I forced myself to watch it. I needed to remember why I was doing this. If I had cried that night, I whispered to the empty room. If I had begged you to let me stay, you would never have grown up. You would have stayed a child forever. I closed the laptop with a snap. I chose to let you hate me. Ethan, I said into the darkness, as long as you survive to become a man, I will live with your hatred. 3 weeks into my new reality, I learned that poverty is not just about having no money. It is about the constant, low-level panic that hums in your chest from the moment you wake up. I stood in the aisle of a discount grocery store, staring at a bottle of red wine that cost $12. A month ago, I would have used that bottle for cooking sauce without a second thought. Now, I did the math in my head. $12 was 3 days of food if I stuck to instant noodles and discounted bread. I put the bottle back on the shelf. My hand lingered on the glass for a second, a pathetic goodbye to the man I used to be. Just the noodles today, I told the cashier, avoiding eye contact as I counted out the crumpled bills and coins. I went back to my suffocating studio apartment and opened my laptop. The battery was dying, and I had lost the charger during the move, so I had to sit on the floor near the only working outlet. I scrolled through job boards, bypassing the architectural firms that had already rejected me. I needed cash. I needed it now. That was when I saw it. Assistant building supervisor needed Lakeview Gardens. Must be able to read technical blueprints and perform physical labor. Salary $45,000 a year. I stared at the screen. $45,000. That was less than what Sabrina and I had spent on our summer trip to the Amalfi Coast. It was humiliating. It was a step backward so large it felt like falling off a cliff. But then I looked at the eviction notice from the penthouse that I had kept as a souvenir of my stupidity. I had no choice. I submitted the application. When a friend from my old life texted me asking where I had been, I typed back, I am consulting on some private projects. Super busy. Catch you later. I felt the bile rise in my throat as I hit send. The interview was the next morning. Lakeview Gardens was a complex of brick buildings on the edge of the suburbs, sturdy, unpretentious, and miles away from the glass towers of the Loop. I met Dana Ruiz in a basement office that smelled of coffee and floor wax. She was a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and hair pulled back in a severe ponytail. She did not offer me water. "I see you have an architecture degree," Dana said, tapping my resume with a pen. "You worked at a downtown firm. Why do you want to be a super's assistant? This is not a design job, pretty boy. This is grunt work." I shifted in the metal chair. I want to understand the practical side of buildings, the systems. Dana leaned forward, her expression hard. "Let me be clear. If a pipe bursts at 3 in the morning, I call you. If a tenant throws up in the lobby, you clean it. You are going to be carrying trash, hauling drywall, and dealing with angry people who cannot pay their rent. Are you ready for that? Or are you just slumming it until a better offer comes along?" I looked at her. I wanted to lie. I wanted to use my charm. But I was tired. I was so tired of pretending to be important. "I just lost everything," I said, my voice quiet. "I do not have a better offer coming. I need this job. I need to prove I can actually work." Dana studied me for a long silence. "You have got soft hands, but we are short-staffed. I will give you a month of probation. If you are late once, you are out." The first week was a physical beating. I had spent years drawing lines on CAD software, but I had never realized how heavy a bag of drywall compound actually was. I was clumsy. I dropped tools. I spent 3 hours trying to locate a water shut-off valve while a tenant screamed at me about her ruined rug. "You are useless," the woman yelled. I am trying." "Ma'am?" I stammered, sweat dripping into my eyes. But slowly, the fog of my ego began to lift. I started to learn the rhythm of the building. I met Mrs. Higgins in 2B, a retired teacher who lived alone and made tea for me when I came to check her radiator. I met the young couple in 4F who worked night shifts and slept on a mattress on the floor, just like I did. I met a single mother who woke up at 5 in the morning to bundle her daughter up for daycare before heading to a factory job. These people were not demographics for a marketing pitch. They were real. They worked harder than I ever had, and they didn't post about it on Instagram. One night, the main elevator in Building C stalled between floors. It was 2 in the morning. Dana was out with the flu, so it was on me. I went to the machine room on the roof, shivering in the cold wind. I opened the control panel, my flashlight beam cutting through the grease and dust. I looked at the complex system of pulleys, cables, and circuit boards. For years, I had walked into elevators in penthouses and pressed a button, annoyed if it took more than 10 seconds to arrive. I had never thought about the mechanism. I had never thought about the person who had to wake up in the middle of the night to grease these gears so that people like me could glide effortlessly to the sky. "It is not magic," I whispered to myself, wiping grease on my jeans. "It is work. Someone has to keep it running." I reset the breaker and adjusted the tension, following the manual with shaking hands. When the gears finally engaged with a heavy clunk and the car began to move, I felt a surge of pride that was sharper and more real than any compliment I had ever received on a design. I sat back on the cold concrete floor, staring at my dirty hands, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel the urge to wash them immediately. One Tuesday morning, a black sedan pulled up to the curb of Lakeview Gardens. I was outside salting the walkway against the coming frost. I froze when I saw Marcus step out of the driver's seat. He opened the rear door for an older woman with grey hair pulled into a tight bun, wearing a thick wool coat that swallowed her frame. My heart hammered against my ribs. "Mum," I took a step forward, the bag of salt slipping in my grip. But then Dana stepped out of the office, clipboard in hand, and greeted them. "Mr. Lee? Ms. Hartman," Dana said, shaking the woman's hand. "Right this way for the inspection?" "Hartman. Of course." I shook my head, turning back to the ice. I was hallucinating. My mother was probably in Paris or Tuscany, spending her dividends. She was not inspecting a mid-century brick complex in the suburbs. Yet, as they walked past, I felt the woman's eyes sweep over me. It was not a look of recognition. It was a look of assessment. Later that afternoon, I was mopping the second-floor hallway when Mr. Henderson, a grumpy tenant in his 80s, shuffled out of his apartment. He dropped a crumpled flyer on the floor right where I had just cleaned. "This hallway is filthy," he grumbled, leaning heavily on his cane. "You call this maintenance? I pay good money to live here." The old Ethan would have snapped. I would have told him that his rent was peanuts and that he had dropped the trash himself. The words were on the tip of my tongue. But then I looked at him. I saw the tremors in his hands and the frayed cuffs of his sweater. If I yelled, he would just be an old man scared of a young, angry guy. I took a breath. I swallowed the rage until it tasted like ash. "I am sorry. Mr. Henderson," I said, picking up the flyer. "I will make sure it is spotless. You have a good afternoon." He blinked, surprised by the lack of a fight, and grumbled something unintelligible before retreating into his unit. The real test came a week later during a blackout. The temperature dropped to 10 degrees, and the grid overloaded. The building went dark at 1 in the morning. Ethan Dana's voice crackled over the radio. "Get the emergency lights in the stairwells. Then check on the seniors. 4th floor first." I spent the next 4 hours running up and down the stairs. My legs burned. I carried heavy wool blankets from the storage unit to the residents who had no heat. I guided people with flashlights. When I knocked on Mrs. Higgins' door in apartment 4C, she was sitting in the dark, wrapped in a shawl. "I was scared," she whispered, her voice trembling. "My phone died. I have got you. Mrs. Higgins," I said, kneeling to light the battery-operated lantern I had brought. "I am not going anywhere until the power is back. Do you need extra socks when the lights finally flickered on at 5 in the morning?" I went back to my basement room. I was soaked in sweat despite the freezing cold. My hands were black with dust. I sat on my mattress, exhausted. But for the first time in years, I did not feel empty. I felt useful. The next day, Dana called me into the office. She did not praise me, but she slid a stack of technical drawings across the desk. "You know CAD?" "Right," she asked. "The fire escape plans are outdated. Redraw them, and check the elevator maintenance logs while you are at it. I need a full report for the owners." I threw myself into the work. I was not designing a skyscraper to stroke my ego anymore. I was drawing escape routes that Mrs. Higgins could actually understand if there was a fire. That evening, Mrs. Higgins invited me to dinner. She made a tuna casserole that cost maybe $5 to make. We sat at her small kitchen table, and she told me about her years teaching history. It was simple. It was humble. And it tasted better than the $300 steak I had eaten with Sabrina the night I was evicted. Across town, in a quiet house, Eleanor sat reading the monthly report from Lakeview Gardens. Her eyes stopped on a note from Dana Ruiz. Assistant E. Cole took initiative during the outage, prioritized vulnerable tenants, also managed a conflict with Mr. Henderson, without escalation. Recommendation, retain. Eleanor lowered the paper. She took off her glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose. She wanted to call him. She wanted to tell him she was proud. But she stayed silent. Not yet, she told herself. He is still soft. He needs to harden a little more. A few days later, I was in the lobby, sketching a new layout for the emergency lighting on a drafting table I had set up. The front door opened, and Marcus walked in with Ms. Hartman. I tried to stay focused on my work, but Ms. Hartman stopped right behind me. Your sensor placement is wrong, she said. Her voice was raspy, low. I turned around. Excuse me. Smoke rises, she said, pointing a gloved finger at my drawing. But in these old hallways, the draft comes from the north vents. If you put the sensor there, it will trigger 10 seconds too late. Move it to the opposite wall. I stared at the drawing. She was right. It was a detail only someone who knew the airflow of this specific building would know. It was brilliant. Thank you, I said, genuinely impressed. Are you an architect? I am just a landlord, she replied flatly. She turned and walked out the door with Marcus. I stood on the threshold, watching them go. As she descended the stairs to the car, her posture slumped slightly, just for a second. It was a gesture of fatigue I had seen 1,000 times in my childhood kitchen. My breath caught in my throat. The way she held her purse, the way she leaned into the wind. Mum, I whispered to the empty air. I realized then, with a pang of physical pain, that I did not miss the money. I missed her. I missed the woman who had tried to teach me things I was too arrogant to learn. And I realized that Ms. Hartman knew more about building a life than I ever did. Spring arrived in Chicago not with flowers, but with a violent storm that battered the city for 48 hours straight. At Lakeview Gardens, the old brickwork held firm, but the roof of Building B finally surrendered to the gale force winds. I was in the basement maintenance room when the call came through. It was midnight. Ethan Dana's voice was jagged with static and panic over the phone. I am stuck on the interstate. A semi-truck jackknifed across 3 lanes. I cannot get there for at least 2 hours. What is happening? I shouted over the roar of thunder shaking the foundation. The roof membrane on Building B tore loose. She yelled, "Water is pouring into the 5th floor. It is heading straight for the main junction box. If that gets wet, the whole heating system blows, and we could have an electrical fire. You are the only one there. You have to secure the building until the emergency crew arrives." My stomach dropped. I was just an assistant. I was the guy who plunged toilets. Now I was responsible for 300 lives. "I am on it," I said, hanging up. I grabbed the master keys and a heavy flashlight. I did not take the elevator. I sprinted up 5 flights of stairs, my lungs burning. When I kicked open the door to the 5th floor hallway, the water was already an inch deep, soaking into the cheap carpet. The smell of ozone-frying electricity was faint but undeniable. I did not think about my ruined shoes. I ran to the utility closet and threw the main breaker for the upper grid, plunging the hallway into darkness. "Everyone out!" I shouted, banging on doors. "We need to move to the lower floors." Now doors opened. Confused, frightened faces peered out into the beam of my flashlight. I wasn't Ethan Cole, the arrogant architect in a bespoke suit anymore. I was just a man in muddy work boots trying to do the right thing. I organized a bucket brigade with 2 young guys from apartment 5C to slow the water. I carried Mr. Henderson down 2 flights of stairs because his knees could not take the descent. On the 3rd floor landing, I found a little girl, maybe 6 years old, clutching a stuffed rabbit and sobbing while her mother tried to pack a bag. "It is the monster," the girl cried, pointing at the dark ceiling where the thunder boomed. I knelt down, ignoring the icy water soaking my knees. I looked her in the eye. "That is not a monster," I said, my voice steady and soft. "That is just the sky clapping its hands. And you know what I used to fight the elevator ghosts in the basement. I beat them all. Nothing is getting past me tonight. You are safe." She stopped crying and nodded, gripping her rabbit. By the time the professional repair crew arrived at 3 in the morning, I was soaked to the bone and covered in drywall dust. The foreman, a burly guy named Rick, tried to push past me. "We need to find the breach." Rick barked. "It is above Unit 502, I said, blocking his path and shoving a wet blueprint into his chest. "The water is tracking along the HVAC duct. If you cut the ceiling there, you miss it. You need to go in through the utility chase on the north wall." I mapped it out. Rick looked at the drawing, then at me. "Who are you? I am the super," I said. The next morning, inside the quiet sanctuary of her home office, Eleanor sat with Marcus. On her laptop screen, a grainy black and white video from the security cameras played. It showed a figure in a soaked hoodie carrying an old man down the stairs. It showed that same figure wading through water to check a fuse box, wiping mud from his face with a trembling hand, then turning back to help a tenant carry a crate of books. Eleanor watched it 3 times. She paused the video on a frame where Ethan was leaning against a wall, exhausted, head in his hands. "He looks like Jacob," Marcus said softly. Eleanor gripped the arm of her chair until her knuckles turned white. Her eyes were wet, but her voice was steel. "He acted like Jacob." Finally, 2 days later, the board of Heartline Developments met to discuss the damages. The repair bill was estimated at $80,000. We should raise the rent across the complex by 5% to cover the deductible, a board member suggested. "The market can bear it." "No," Eleanor said from the head of the table. Her voice brooked no argument. "We will cover the repairs from the contingency fund. We are not punishing our tenants for a storm." She looked around the room. "And regarding the staff, we just saw what happens when we have a building manager who actually cares about the property, not just the paycheck. I want that replicated." She slid a folder to Marcus. "Launch the Heartline Revitalization Initiative. We are going to accept proposals for renovating our older B-class properties into safe, affordable, energy-efficient housing. Winner gets to lead the pilot project." And Ethan Marcus asked later, when the others had left. "Have Dana give him the application," Eleanor said. "Let us see if he can draw something real." That night, Ethan sat at his small, wobble-legged table in the basement apartment. He was exhausted. His body ached from the storm cleanup. But spread out in front of him were sketches, not of glass penthouses or infinity pools. He was drawing a reinforced roof drainage system. He was designing wider hallways for seniors like Mr. Henderson and soundproofed study corners for kids like the girl with the rabbit. He was not drawing to impress a client. He was drawing because he knew exactly what it felt like to be cold and wet on the 5th floor, and he was determined that no one in his building would feel that way again. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning with a subject line that made my heart stop. Invitation to present Heartline Revitalization Concept. It was an invitation to the corporate headquarters downtown, the same glass monolith I used to drive past in my Tesla. dreaming of one day being important enough to enter. The email was signed by a name I had never seen on any industry roster. Cole, chairman of the board. I stared at the screen, my brow furrowed. I knew no one named E. Cole. 2 days later, I stood in the lobby of the Heartline Tower. I was wearing my old navy suit, the one I had carefully depilled with a razor blade the night before. Under my arm, I carried a model made of cardboard and balsa wood, not 3D printed resin. I felt small. I felt like an imposter. The secretary led me into the main conference room. It was a cavern of glass and steel with a view that stretched all the way to the horizon. 10 people in expensive suits sat around a long oval table, but I only saw one. Sitting at the head of the table, wearing a sharp charcoal blazer and her signature glasses, was my mother. I froze in the doorway, my grip on the cardboard model tightening until it crunched. My brain refused to process the image. This was Eleanor Cole, the woman who clipped coupons and cooked in a small kitchen. This was not the chairman of a billion-dollar empire. "Mom," I choked out, the word sounding childish in the silent room. She did not smile. She did not stand up to hug me. She looked at me with the cold, assessing gaze of a CEO looking at a risky investment. "Mr. Cole," she said, her voice projecting clearly across the room. "Please take your seat. This board is interested in your proposal for the Lakeview Gardens renovation. You have 15 minutes. She was not giving me a second to process the shock. She was treating me like a stranger. I stumbled to the podium, my hands shaking so hard I nearly dropped my notes. I looked at the board members, then back at her. Her face was a mask of stone. I took a deep breath. I forced myself to forget about the woman at the head of the table and remembered the little girl with the rabbit during the storm. "The problem with low-income housing isn't the budget," I began, my voice gaining strength. "It is the lack of dignity in the design. During the storm last week, I saw elderly residents struggling on wet stairs because the grip tape had worn away 10 years ago. I saw water damage that could have been prevented with a simple drainage reroute that costs less than $500. I spoke for 20 minutes. I did not use buzzwords. I talked about water pressure, thermal insulation, and the reality of living paycheck to paycheck. When I finished, the room was silent. The board grilled me. They asked about cost-benefit ratios and legal liability. I answered every question, not with theories I learned in school, but with the grit I had learned plunging toilets and fixing radiators. Marcus, sitting to my mother's right, gave a barely perceptible nod. "Thank you." "Gentlemen," Eleanor said, closing her folder, "please leave us. I need to conduct the final interview privately." The room cleared. The heavy glass door clicked shut. It was just the two of us. The silence stretched between us, heavier than the building itself. She reached under the table and pulled out a thick folder. She slid it across the polished wood until it stopped in front of me. I opened it. My breath hitched. It was everything. The deed to the penthouse, the registration for the Tesla, the credit card statements, the employment contract for my old job. And clipped to the front was a document titled Heartline Development's Ownership Structure. "I own it all." "Ethan," she said, her voice devoid of triumph, filled only with a weary sadness. "The penthouse you bragged about mine. The car you drove mine. The job you thought you were too good for my company." Why I whispered, tears pricking my eyes. Why did you let me believe? Because I wanted to protect you, she said, standing up and walking to the window. I thought if you didn't know about the money, you would build your own character. But instead, I watched you turn into a man who would humiliate his own mother to impress a room full of strangers. That night at the party, when you told me to pay rent, she turned back to me, her eyes flashing. I realized I had failed. I had to let you fall. I had to let you hit the bottom so you could see what solid ground actually felt like. I looked down at the papers. The shame was a physical weight in my gut. I thought about the way I had treated her. I thought about the arrogance, the wasted money, the cruelty. I am sorry, I said. And for the first time in my life, it was not a manipulation. I let the tears fall. I do not want the money. Mom, I do not deserve a single cent of it. If you want to cut me out, I understand. I just need you to know, I am not that guy anymore. I am not the guy who evicted you. Eleanor studied my face for a long moment. She reached into her jacket and pulled out a single, crisp document. I am not giving you the penthouse back, she said sternly. I am not giving you the car, and you are going to pay back every dollar you spent on that credit card, with interest. She placed the document in front of me. This is a contract. She continued. You will lead the revitalization project. You will work 60 hours a week. The salary is modest. You will live in an apartment you pay for yourself. If you stick to this for 5 years, and if the board approves your performance, we will discuss partnership. Until then, you are just an employee. Suddenly, there was a commotion at the door. The handle turned, and Sabrina burst in, followed by a flustered security guard. She was dressed in a new designer outfit, holding a phone up as if live streaming. Ethan Eleanor, she exclaimed, putting on a bright, fake smile. I heard the incredible news. I knew we could work this out. Think of the branding potential, the redemption arc. Eleanor did not even blink. She pressed a button on the intercom. Security. Remove this unauthorized person and serve her with the cease and desist order regarding the use of the Cole family name. Wait. What? Sabrina screeched as 2 guards took her by the arms. Ethan, tell them who I am. I didn't look at her. I looked at the contract. There were no clauses for love. There were no promises of forgiveness. It was a sentence to hard labor. I picked up the pen. I looked at my mother. I do not ask you to forgive me today. I am going to work until I am worth forgiving. I signed my name. Eleanor signed the line next to mine. She capped her pen. She did not open her arms. She stood up and extended her hand across the table. From today on, you earn every brick. Ethan, she said, if you can do that, we will see about the rest. I took her hand. Her grip was firm, calloused, and strong. It felt like a judgment, but it also felt like a lifeline. We walked out of the conference room together. The hallway was flooded with light. I walked a step behind her, clutching the folder to my chest. I had lost the fake empire I built in my head, but as I followed my mother toward the elevators, I knew I was finally starting to build something that would not blow away in the storm. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I would love to know where you guys are tuning in from. So please drop your city or country in the comments below, because I really want to connect with you all and hear your thoughts. If you enjoyed this drama, please smash that subscribe button for Grandma's Family Diary. Hit the like. And do not forget to press the hype button to help this story reach even more people. Your support means the world to us.